Unlike the advanced societies of other parts of the world, the great civilizations of ancient America were, for the most part, illiterate. Although the first immigrants crossed into Alaska from Asia at least 30,000 years ago, and although the entire continent was populated by about 7,000 BC, very few pre-Columbian societies have left us documentary records. What they have left us, in Central America and the Andean regions of South America, are the majestic ruins of their cities and their places of worship. But only the Maya have left us any written clues to what these ruins were used for, and their inscriptions and codices remain largely undeciphered. If ever their hieroglyphs are decoded, we may have early American chronicles and legends to set beside those of ancient China, Assyria, and Egypt. But for the time being, to learn about the societies that existed before Columbus discovered America in 1493, the societies we call pre-Columbian, we must turn to the archaeologists and look at some of their discoveries. The engineering skills of the Incas who built this fortress outside Cusco in Peru are a source of amazement even to non-specialists. No cement binds these giant stones together, and some of them weigh as much as 30 tons. This terracotta vessel with its grotesque features may have been used in religious rituals by the Toltecs of Mexico. This portrait of a Moche man comes from the coastal region of what is now Peru, where it was made well over 1,000 years ago. One of the last of the great Andean civilizations, the Incas, produced this fine vessel shortly before the Spanish conquest. The stirrup or handle on the back of this Nazca puppy made in southern Peru is a characteristic ingredient of much South American pottery. Thanks to the patient excavation of major sites, certain events of great importance can be recognized. Almost all of these seem to have taken place in Central and South America. It's here that the earliest evidence of domesticated plants and farming villages has been found, and here too that almost all the major empires later developed. One of the earliest known to us is the Olmec civilization, which was flourishing on the Gulf of Mexico by about 1200 BC. They established a state whose population numbered tens of thousands and included a priesthood, a civil service, and a hierarchy of social classes. The Olmecs were also skilled craftsmen who fashioned works of stone ranging from ceremonial jade axe heads like these, depicting baby faces with jaguar fangs, to colossal likenesses of their gods. The Olmecs continued to dominate the area until roughly the time of Christ. In the eastern Andes, the first great temples were built at Cotoche around 2000 BC, but they were to be eclipsed by the religious cult centers at Chavinda-Huantar from about 1000 BC onwards. But neither of these civilizations survived, like so many of the tribes and societies who have left us an archaeological record. Who would have worn this extraordinary clay mask from the vanished Teotihuacan civilization of Mexico? Why did the Zapotecs build this complex of platforms and temples at Monte Alban, also in Mexico? We can only guess at the answers. But archaeology does show that both these cultures flourished in the central isthmus between the years AD 300 and 700. Like many others, however, they were overshadowed by the most brilliant of all Native American civilizations, the Maya. The Maya originated in the rainforests of the tropical lowlands of Guatemala and Belize. In their prime, between AD 300 and 900, they came to control western Honduras, eastern Campeche, and northern Yucatan. By the beginning of the classic phase of Maya civilization around the year AD 300, enormous stone-built city centers had grown up in a number of places, such as Tikal in lowland Guatemala. Huge plaster-floored plazas were surrounded by massive stepped pyramids topped by temples and impressive multi-storied buildings. The vast amount of labor that must have gone into the construction of these cities indicates the existence of a very large population. For its support, Sophisticated agricultural techniques were developed, with systems of raised fields specially suited to intensive land use. This prosperous civilization of the tropical rainforest produced elegant artistic creations in what appears to have been an unpromising environment. Stone reliefs, sculptures and carved jade were fashioned to record events associated with the Mayans' rulers and gods. Their intellectual achievement was equally impressive. They excelled in astronomical and astrological observation and calculation, devising a numerical system based on units of 20 and including the concept of zero. They elaborated and refined the 52-year calendar, intermeshing the 365-day solar year with a 260-day ceremonial cycle, and calculated dates from the year 3113 BC. The Maya were obsessed with the recording of time and erected carved stone stelae and altars to mark the passage of set periods, as well as to commemorate important events such as the accession, anniversary, or death of rulers. These monuments are festooned with explanatory hieroglyphic texts, but so far only the glyphs concerning numbers, dates, gods, place names, and genealogies have been deciphered. Many hundreds of others remain unexplained. So we do not know why, sometime in the 9th century AD, this vast and intricate society collapsed quite suddenly, leaving sites like this one at Palenque totally abandoned. Perhaps the Maya were laid low by epidemic disease, or perhaps there was an invasion. But whatever the reason, from about AD 500, a second focus of American civilization grew up in the high Andean basins of the southern continent. Two centers, Tiahuanaco and Huari, dominated much of the Andes between AD 600 and 800. They were linked by a common religion, symbolized by the gateway god on the Gateway of the Sun near Lake Titicaca in Bolivia, where these desolate ruins are all that remain of Tiahuanaco. The neighboring civilization of Huari was a powerful military state. By AD 700, it dominated half of modern Peru. But both civilizations disappeared soon after AD 800, for reasons that are still unknown. By this time, pre-Columbian America was supporting some 1,000 different tribal societies, speaking distinct and often unrelated languages. But we know virtually nothing about any of them beyond the archaeologists' harvest of pottery, artifacts and ruins. Only for Mexico do we enter in the 12th century AD upon a period for which detailed histories with names, dates and personalities become possible. For records began to be kept that were later assembled and analyzed. Bernardino de Sahagún, a Franciscan missionary, arrived in Mexico in 1529 at the age of 30. For the remaining 60 years of his life, aided by a group of Aztecs whom he trained himself, he compiled 12 illustrated volumes entitled General History of the Things of New Spain. In it, Sahagún tried to describe every aspect of the lands and peoples newly acquired for Spain. It was not, of course, a perfect history. Some records had been tampered with, since each Aztec ruler tended to rewrite history in his own image, and others were lost. but it's made the Aztecs and their empire the best-known native civilization in America. Between the 7th and 10th centuries, barbarian tribes invaded Mexico. Amongst them were the Toltecs, who built their capital at Tula. Founded about AD 950, Tula became the center of the Toltec military state and the hub of its trading network. At this time, the population seems to have revered a religious leader known as Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent. These monuments at Chichen Itza were built by his devotees. But in the year 987, he and his followers were expelled from Tula by a rival religious group, which advocated human sacrifices to the gods in preference to Quetzalcoatl's symbolic offerings of jade, butterflies, and snakes. The defeated leader and his followers marched from Tula, past Lake Texcoco and the twin volcanoes, to the Gulf of Mexico, where, according to one tradition, he sailed westward on a raft of serpents, prophesying that he would return one day to claim his people. But the ascendancy of the Toltecs ended about 2 centuries later, as fresh waves of northerners, known as the Chichimecs, migrated from their increasingly arid homelands and overran the empire. Tula itself was destroyed in about AD 1170, but a second capital, Chichen Itza, survived for another half-century, falling into dereliction by the early 13th century. In AD 1345, one of the Chichimec tribes, the Aztecs, arrived in the Valley of Mexico and settled on a group of islands in the swampy margins of Lake Texcoco, where they built their capital, Tenochtitlan. In less than a century, they had transformed themselves from a tribal group to a well-organized state and had become rulers of the valley. The people they conquered were forced to pay heavy tribute, and the inventories kept by the conquerors, meticulously noting clothes and armor, cribs filled with maize and other foodstuffs, as well as an eagle, form a major part of the surviving Aztec records. But there was also another, more important form of tribute. Continuous warfare likewise supplied captives who could be sacrificed to the bloodthirsty gods Tezcatlipoca and Huitzilopochtli. Tens of thousands of victims were killed each year by having their beating hearts ripped from their bodies as an offering to the sun, which the Aztecs also worshipped. On special occasions, the Aztecs demanded sacrifices on an almost unimaginable scale. At the consecration of a great new temple in Tenochtitlan in the year 1487, 2 columns of victims were assembled and ordered to climb the steps in close order towards the priests at the altars at the top. For 4 days and nights the sacrifice continued, and if the priests' arms grew weary of hacking out hearts, replacements were quickly found. Most sources agree that on this occasion 20,000 men and women were ritually murdered. Some of them were local slaves. Others were prisoners captured in the Aztecs' numerous and victorious wars. But most were victims brought along as tribute by neighboring princes who had been defeated in the past. But the system broke down under Montezuma II. He was nephew of the preceding emperor and was elected in the year 1503 by the usual council of nobles, generals, and priests. Montezuma II won several victories at the start of his reign and brought back many victims for sacrifice during his coronation festivities. But after this, Montezuma's behavior became more autocratic, and he increased the tribute required from both his subjects and his neighbors. The story of Montezuma II was recorded in this series of watercolors, later published in a book called The History of the New Indies. There were some local revolts against his authority, and after 1510, some successful resistance by neighboring states. Also in 1510, a comet was observed over Mexico, which astrologers interpreted as a warning of the return of Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent, banished 550 years before. When, not long afterwards, rumors multiplied that white-skinned, bearded strangers had appeared in the islands of the Gulf, there were many in Mexico who longed for deliverance from the arbitrary rule of Montezuma. No sooner had Christopher Columbus returned to Europe from his first voyage of discovery than plans were laid to colonize the islands of the Caribbean. The first settlement on Hispaniola was established in 1493, with the aims of exploiting the island's precious metals and serving as a base for trade with China, which was still believed to be nearby. But further exploration revealed only more islands, and the mainland of an uncivilized country which was certainly not Cathay. The disease-ridden settlers soon exhausted the first easy pickings of gold, pearls, and slaves. And though profits could be made from growing sugarcane and exporting dyewood, this was not the glorious, treasure-stuffed new world they had expected. So they looked further afield. Columbus himself explored part of the South American coast. Balboa landed at Panama and was the first European to see the Pacific. But he found little gold, so the quest continued. In 1519, Hernán Cortés, the young mayor of Havana, was appointed leader of a 600-strong colonizing expedition which set sail in the service of God and His Majesty Charles V, and to give light to those who sat in darkness, and also to acquire that wealth which most men covet. Cortés landed at Vera Cruz and quickly crushed the opposition of the local inhabitants. Indian padded cotton armor offered little protection against the steel swords, guns, and crossbows of the mounted invaders. Spanish steel armor kept out most Indian weapons of wood and flint. The defeated Indians were so impressed by Cortés and his men that they became their allies. Together they set off from Vera Cruz for the Aztec capital, Tenochtitlan, and as they marched, many other tribes, alienated by Montezuma's oppression, joined them. By the time they had reached the pass between the two volcanoes that guard the Valley of Mexico, and gazed down at the capital, linked by causeways to the shores of the lake, Cortés was at the head of a powerful army. Evil omens had recently been seen in the city, predicting disaster, and many believed the white-skinned Spaniards to be Quetzalcoatl and his followers. So Montezuma, uncertain how to proceed, led them into the city, where he showered them with rich gifts. With his soldiers in command of the city, Cortés proceeded to take Montezuma captive. He now held both the capital and the ruler. But at this triumphant moment, he was suddenly recalled to Cuba. Without Cortés, the Spanish soldiers left in Tenochtitlan panicked and massacred a number of the local inhabitants whilst they were taking part in a religious service. The massacre was brutal and bloody, and the Aztecs rose against them. On hearing the news, Cortés hurried back to rejoin his besieged men, but their situation was impossible. The one man who could have helped them, Montezuma, was killed while pleading with his former subjects for peace. The Spaniards made a daring pre-dawn escape along one of the causeways linking Tenochtitlan to the shores of the lake. But the Aztecs were forewarned, and 3/4 of the fugitives, weighed down by their loot, were killed before they reached safety. It was here, in the midst of defeat, that Cortés showed his true mettle. Instead of abandoning the enterprise, he planned a new campaign with his surviving Indian allies. First they subdued the provinces around the great lake in which the capital lay. Then they built a small fleet in order to protect their simultaneous advance along the 3 causeways leading to the city. The Aztecs still put up a desperate fight, but after weeks of fighting, worn down by famine and disease, the defenders surrendered in August 1521. Cortés had won the whole of Mexico from the Pacific to the Caribbean, an area larger than Spain itself, for his master, the Emperor Charles V. Now it was the turn of Peru. The most famous of the South American civilizations, the Inca Empire, was also one of the briefest, taking shape only a century before its destruction. In 1438, Pachacuti Inca came to the throne, and began a series of conquests which, over the next 20 years, extended Inca suzerainty from Lake Titicaca to Lake Junin. His son, Topa Inca, pushed the boundary further north to Quito, and then turned on the only rival civilized state in Peru, the coastal kingdom of Timor. Timor was defeated in 1476, after which the empire was enlarged southwards to include much of present-day Chile. In 40 years, an empire had been created which stretched for 2,000 miles along the Andes and included the Pacific coast and parts of the upper Amazon. This meteoric growth was only possible because of extraordinarily thorough social and political organization. Inca society was strictly hierarchical and rigidly ordered, and this was fully reflected in the imposing architecture of the mountain stronghold of Machu Picchu. State control of labor and resources maintained the well-trained army and provided the workforce and materials needed to carry out the schemes of architects, engineers, and administrators. A street plan of the Inca capital, Cusco, still clearly apparent in the layout of the city today, shows the intersection of the major highways, which linked the capital with the fringes of the empire. "10,000 miles of paved roads, bridges, and tunnels exemplified Inca ability and efficiency. But a fatal flaw existed in this quasi-welfare state. All power devolved from one man, the supreme Inca. In 1525, Huayna Capac died, leaving rival claimants to the throne, Huascar and Atahualpa. Internal dissent split the empire, and a bloody civil war began. At precisely this moment, the Spaniards arrived. Led by the 50-year-old Francisco Pizarro, the invaders may only have numbered 180 men, but they were all motivated by consuming ambition and religious zeal. They possessed the great advantage of horses, steel weapons, and armor, and in Mexico they had learned how to use them most effectively against the Indians. But at first they scarcely needed to fight. When they reached the highlands of Peru in 1532, Atahualpa had recently defeated his brother Huascar and was encamped with his army of up to 80,000 men near the town of Cajamarca. Remembering how useful the kidnapping of Montezuma had been to Cortés in Mexico, Pizarro seized Atahualpa during a parley and held him hostage for an enormous ransom. When it had been paid, Pizarro had him murdered. Without their divine leader, weakened by civil war and scourged by epidemics of European disease, the native peoples of the Andes soon succumbed to the conquistadors. However, today there are still millions of pure-blooded Indians, like the Aymaran people who live here in Bolivia. The languages of the Maya, the Aztecs, and the Incas are still spoken. The rural peoples still dress, eat, and farm much as their ancestors did. But for better or worse, the political destiny of Latin America now lay in the hands of the Europeans.